Welcome to this session. Today's session is dedicated towards a discussion of the impact of COVID-19 and its related restrictions on the Indian agriculture. It was on 30th January 2020 that the first reported case of COVID infection was observed in India. Subsequent to this reported infection, it was in March 2020 that a lockdown of the entire economy was announced by the government. This lockdown was across the entire economy, resulting in a stoppage of production activities in most of the sectors, distribution, transportation, retailing, everything came to a halt. And as a result of this lockdown, the Indian economy suffered an irreversible loss, which is indicated by the fact that in 2020-21, there was a massive contraction of Indian GDP, as a result of which there was a negative growth of India's GDP to the tune of 7.3%. This implies that in comparison to the value of GDP in 2019-20, India's GDP got lowered by 7.3% in 2020-21. The contraction of the Indian economy led to a severe impact on the income levels of the Indian labor force. Across industry, services and agriculture sector, there was a considerable reduction in the income levels and many people lost their jobs. The situation was particularly severe in the unorganized sector. The problem was compounded by the case of migrant labor. It is in this background that we feel worthwhile to have a look at the agriculture sector in particular. Now, one may question why we need to have a particular look at the agriculture sector. This is because even though India has achieved a substantial industrial progress and today the service sector contributes more than 50% to India's GDP, it is the agriculture sector which is crucial to the country's economic progress. Because not only the agriculture sector contributes more than 1/6 of India's GDP, but it employs about 50% of India's labor force. And the agriculture sector has a huge effect on poverty alleviation, because if there are increase in the level of farm incomes, it directly increases the income level of the farmers, which goes a long way towards their improvement of their economic condition. Apart from this, the growth in agriculture through its backward and forward linkages generates a market for the industrial goods and spurs industrial growth. It has been pointed out by World Bank that a growth in the agriculture sector affects poverty alleviation 2 times more than what a growth in other sector can achieve. So, realizing this crucial importance of agriculture in Indian economy, the government, after an initial period of imposition of strict restrictions, relaxed restrictions in the agriculture sector, where partial productive activities were allowed with adherence to the COVID norms. But in spite of this, agriculture sector was considerably affected by COVID and the subsequent lockdown. In order to assess how and to what extent the agriculture sector bore the brunt of COVID 19, we need to look at certain specific factors. Firstly, we would try to have a look at the overall production of agriculture and the allied sectors. Then we would take a look at the agricultural input markets, that is, how far the availability of agricultural input was affected, both in terms of supply as also in terms of its prices. Then we will have a look at the impact of this COVID and its related restrictions on farm gate prices in the agriculture and allied sectors. And thereafter, the agricultural labor market will come in contention, because this is a very important area. And finally, we will try to assess the impact of COVID on marketing of agricultural produce and on banking activities, which is necessary for continuation of agricultural activity. So let us now start with the overall output scenario in the agriculture and allied sectors. It can be observed that there has been a general decline in the production level in the agriculture and allied sector. However, the agricultural sector has suffered a relatively lesser loss in terms of a decline in the level of output. It can be observed from the data provided by the government that production levels in the agricultural sector has undergone a decline by 2.7% during the immediate post-COVID period. Among the allied sectors, the poultry showed the highest decline, where its output level declined by 19.6%, followed by fisheries, where its production level declined by 13.6%. Now, what could be the reason behind this relatively lesser fall in the production level in the agriculture sector? One probable reason that has been pointed out is that by April 2020, across most of the states, what is known as the Rabi crops, that is wheat, mustard, gram, the harvesting period is over. And by the time the lockdown just started to take its effect, the farmers, after completion of the harvest, has removed major portion of the Rabi crops from the field to their homes or to the storage places. So it is because of that the agriculture sector has not been affected to that extent by which the production level in the allied sectors have been affected. But still, for a country like India, with a population of 130 million, a near about 3% fall in agricultural production can make a lot of difference. Next, we look at the impact on farm gate prices in the agriculture and allied sectors. The most significant decline in the farm gate prices among the various sectors of the agriculture and allied sectors was observed in the poultry sector, where the prices declined to the extent of 17.8%. This was followed by the horticulture sector, where the prices declined by 7.6%. And one major reason behind this significant price decline in these sectors could be the nature of the products, because these are perishable and cannot be stored for a long time. Here also, the lowest decline in prices was observed in the agriculture sector, where the prices declined by 2.2%. The dairy and fisheries sector also underwent a moderate price decline. The reason behind such a fall in the production levels as also in the price level of the agricultural sector products was the fact that there was a fall in the level of demand, because the COVID related restrictions imposed restrictions on opening of the markets, the local village huts, the shops, and there was a considerable disruption in the movement of traffic and transport. So the agricultural produce could not be transported to the cities and the urban centers, and even if those were transported, because of the disruption in the opening of the markets and shops, people could not buy it. So there was a lack of demand affecting the agricultural sector, and this resulted in their lowering of the price levels as also a lowering of the production levels. Now we will look at the agricultural input market. The agricultural input is not any one particular item, but it consists of a host of items like fertilizers, pesticides, agricultural machineries which are taken on rentals, fodder or cattle feed. Now, the availability of all these products got affected due to COVID and its related restrictions. At the all India level, looking at the all India level figures, the availability of all kinds of agricultural inputs was observed to have underwent substantial decline. The highest fall in the supply of agricultural inputs was in the fertilizer sector, where it underwent a decline of 11.2%. This was followed by fodder or cattle feed, where the availability declined by 10.8%. The agricultural rental machineries availability also declined by 10.6%. Significant decline was also observed in the availability of pesticides and seeds used in agricultural production. Now, the reason behind the fall in the availability of all these agricultural inputs was again the disruption in the production schedule. Now, the fall in the availability of these agricultural inputs began with disruption in the production schedule. Thereafter, it was compounded by disruption in the transportation available, because there were considerable constraints on movement of vehicles. And finally, the disruption of the retail market. The shops were closed, the huts were closed, so people could not buy. The place from where ultimately this could be available to the farmers, those places of selling, those were closed. So this resulted in a considerable fall in the availability of agricultural inputs. So there was a considerable decline in the availability of agricultural inputs, and like any other commodity, if there is a decrease in the supply of these agricultural inputs, as a result of this, it also resulted in rise in the price level of various agricultural inputs. Now, out of the different agricultural inputs, the fodder or the cattle feed's price went up to very high level, where its increase was by more than 11%. Where the agricultural machinery rental also suffered a significant increase in the price level to the tune of 10.6%. The seeds also experienced a price rise. So, the rising prices of the key agricultural inputs compounded the financial difficulties of the farmers further. Now we look at the impact of COVID and its related restrictions on the agricultural labor market. This is a very vital area because in India, agriculture is still the major source of employment. It employs more than 50% of the Indian labor force. Now, from whatever data and figures are provided by the government, it can be observed that the supply of labor force in the agricultural labor market underwent a considerable decline. It declined to the extent of 20%. But there was a increase in the demand for agricultural labor force, and this increase was to the tune of 6%. The wage level also underwent a minor increase, around 8%. In the rural areas, the dynamics of market demand and supply in the labor market was very peculiar. It depicted a mixed trend. There was an outflux of laborers from agriculturally advanced states where more capital intensive farming was done, more mechanized methods were used, to the relatively backward agricultural states where more labor intensive form of agricultural production practices were there. But now, after the lockdown was imposed, these agricultural laborers who migrated from these relatively advanced agricultural states to the relatively backward agricultural states, they wanted to return back to their native states, and that might have resulted in a shortage of labor in the states which used more labor intensive methods of production, and as a result, in certain areas there could have been a shortage of labor, and this might have resulted in a spiraling of the wage rate. But as the lockdown started taking its effect, as it continued, and as the migratory laborers started returning to their native places, now there was an excess supply of labor. Now these people who were working in other states, who were having a decent income, they suddenly came back to their native places, and it increased at one shot the pool of labor who were in need of jobs. And this resulted in a surplus labor force in many of the states at the later stages of the lockdown, when the migratory laborers came back to their states. Initially the migratory labor were just roaming on the streets. They were unable to find the transport and means of returning to their states. But in the later stages, when they could fully return to their native places, this was a new problem that emerged, that there was an excess surplus labor force in their states, and which were driving down the wage rate to some extent. So it was a mixed effect, as far as the agricultural labor market was concerned, both from the demand and the supply side. But on the whole, the condition of agricultural laborers in particular, and particularly the migratory laborers, worsened in the post-COVID era. Now we will look at the impact of these COVID-related restrictions on marketing of agricultural produce. Now, this is a very vital area because the farmer undertakes production in their fields, and they harvest the crops and stores it in the storage facilities. But that is only one part. The crucial part is how these food grains or agricultural produce is to be distributed across the length and breadth of the country, because then only its availability will be there for all the Indians at reasonable prices, and the farmers will also be able to have cash in their hand. Their money income will be realized. Now, in order to assess the impact of COVID on the marketing of agricultural produce, we need to look at certain key areas. The first is the procurement by government agencies. Now, all said and done, it must be said that the government on its part made extensive arrangements for ensuring procurement from the farmers. Now, the farmers were exempted from the COVID-related restrictions of traveling, and so that they could take their produce to the godowns, the government godowns, the places where government stored it. So the relaxations were provided to them. Besides, there were other significant measures which were also taken by the government to ensure that that part of the produce which government procured did not suffer. So as a result, on this count, the farmers did not suffer much. But the next key area is collection of the farm produce by the private agencies. Now here the farmers suffered a lot, because the private procurement agencies who brought production from the farmers to supply in the market at market prices, now they were affected by these lockdown restrictions, particularly the movement and transport restrictions, and they could not go and collect the agricultural produce from the farmers. So that part of the produce which was collected by the private agencies, there the farmers suffered considerably, and there was supply shortage of as a result in the markets of agricultural produce, and the farmers also could not receive income on this count. The next key aspect of agricultural marketing is the MSP, the minimum support price for the farmers. Now, here also, the farmers were not that much affected because of the arrangements made by the government. And as the government procured the food grains from the farmers, as the government could procure because of the extensive arrangements, the farmers also received their minimum support price. So these receiving of minimum support price was not much of a problem for the farmers. And finally, the aspect of organizing of the local markets or huts. The retail selling of food grains and other agricultural produce through day-to-day transactions in the markets and the local huts in the rural areas, that got affected a lot because of severe restrictions regarding opening of markets and absolute prohibition of opening of huts. So in this regard, the farmers also suffered a lot, and those who engaged in buying their food grades and supplies through these markets and huts, they also suffered a lot. Now we would look at the banking activities. The banking services, particularly in terms of deposit, withdrawal, credit provision, disbursement through Kisan card schemes, these are very, very important for the rural sector, for the agricultural activities, and for the farmers continuing their normal economic activities. Now, in the post-COVID scenario, with the imposition of lockdown restrictions, the banking services were kept out as an essential service out of these lockdown restrictions. But in spite of this, the banking services got severely hit in the rural areas. It is because maybe the COVID restrictions of maintenance of this social distancing, the inherent fear among the village people of contracting the virus if they gathered together. These prevented them from going to the banks, going to the banking institutions, and as a result, one very key area of the rural economic activities, that is provisioning of credit through the Kisan credit card scheme, which actually provides and meets the entire working capital requirements of the farmers and enables them to continue their farming activities. That too was very adversely hit. The disbursement through the credit cards, through the Kisan credit card schemes were considerably reduced, and this resulted in shortage of working capital for the farmers, which they could use for buying inputs, paying wages to the agricultural laborers, or for their transportation. So these got severely affected. The second area of the banking services which were affected was the term lending by banks. Now, these term lending by banks mainly catered to the long-term projects in the agriculture sector. Now, because of these COVID restrictions, the banking personnel could not go to the actual on-field verification of the project, appraisal of the projects, and it also reduced the repayment capabilities of the farmers. The farmers could not repay their earlier term loans because the economic challenges they were facing. And apart from these, the new projects were not coming up due to health and economic uncertainties. So on the whole, this term lending program got severely affected as a result of these COVID restrictions. But one very welcome feature amidst all these sufferings and adversities which the COVID brought, particularly on the agriculture sector, the one very bright area is the area of digital transactions. Now, before the onset of COVID, even the urban India where did not show much of an inclination to choose this digital mode of transactions and keep aside the rural India. Rural India, it was unheard of. But as a result of COVID and its related restrictions, when physical transactions of money was not possible, the digital transactions flourished in the rural India. And the people who were not at all familiar with this process of transactions, they took to these digital transactions, and even if they didn't know on their own, they took assistance from others and became familiar with such digital transactions. So the digital economy, the digital banking system, that got firmly entrenched in rural area. So thus, by looking at all these aspects of Indian agriculture, it can be said that COVID had impacted Indian agriculture in a substantial way. Maybe the agricultural production level has not gone down that much compared to what the poultry, fisheries, dairy sectors have undergone, but the whatever lowering of the production level has been there, in combination with the other demand and supply side factors, that is through backward and forward linkages, the this decline in the economic standards of the farmers because of their lowering of the incomes, the severe economic distress faced by the migratory laborers who worked in this agriculture sector, the the impact on the agriculture sector snowballed into the other sectors and had a severe impact on the economy as a whole, which contributed to that massive contraction which Indian economy suffered in the post-COVID scenario. Thank you for being with us in this session.